Thank you for joining Darien Library this Thursday evening for Voting and Elections with Secretary of State Denise Merrill. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. If you have any questions tonight, please take a look on your screen where the Q&A is located, and you can put all your questions in there, and I'm sure Denise will be happy to answer them later on. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to Michaela from the League of Women Voters. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for this focus on Connecticut, where we're going to be talking about voting and elections here at home with Secretary of State Denise Merrill. I'm Mickey Porta, president of the New Canaan League of Women Voters, and Clara Sartori, my counterpart at the Darien League, and I are grateful to Darien Library for making this possible and to all of you for tuning in. Secretary Merrill is our chief elections official, and the last time we hosted her was before the 2020 general election, when all of us were pretty much in overdrive, making sure people knew how to register to vote, educating them about absentee ballots and in-person voting, trying to answer all of the detailed questions people suddenly had about the voting process, not just what happens front stage, but also backstage as well. So now that the 2020 elections are over, we still have questions around voting. And that's why we've asked Secretary Merrill to join us to talk about how Connecticut both facilitates voter access and at the same time protects election integrity, both before COVID, during COVID, and now moving forward ahead. So we're gonna just jump right in. Welcome, Secretary Merrill. Thank you for being here. Could you talk a little bit about what the current rules are regarding voting access in Connecticut and maybe what some of the reasons behind those rules are?
Sure, and thank you, Mickey and Clara, both of you and the Darien Library for having me once again. I didn't realize actually that the last time I was here was before that election. It just seems already to me like a million years ago. What a year. Yeah, I can't help but just say, as an introduction to this whole topic, something I heard last night actually, that President Biden had a conversation with the media just before his speech. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect that the story of this moment is whether democracy can survive the challenges of the 21st century. The story of this moment is the struggle to preserve democracy as we have known it. And elections are at the epicenter of that question, because elections are how we develop consensus. And he talked about that a little bit. He said, is it possible for us to achieve the consensus we need for a democracy? And I think that is the question on the table with all the things we're discussing around elections and why it's so heated and why people care so much, which frankly warms my heart. I am glad that Americans still care so deeply about elections. I can't tell you the amount of mail and calls and just communication from people before, during, and after the elections about how they were going to get to vote. First of all, of course, during COVID. COVID just dominated the whole year of 2020, and we know that. And it certainly dominated our elections and how we were possibly going to manage to make sure that every person could not compromise their health in order to vote. And that was at the bottom of the changes that we did make to some extent to the rules. Not very many actually, but of course we had many, many more absentee ballots because we did allow, for the first time in Connecticut, people to get an absentee ballot for the reason of the pandemic. There was an emergency order. The governor did an executive order to allow this because in Connecticut, we have some of the most restrictive laws in the country. I would say at this point, probably the most restrictive laws in the country around voting, particularly on how we obtain an absentee ballot. And of course, we have absolutely no days of early voting, as many other states have. Many other states, in fact, at this point, I think almost 40 states have some other day besides that day of Tuesday to vote. So those are two kind of separate questions. we couldn't do anything about the no days of early voting, but we did indeed allow people to get absentee ballots. And the two changes we made just for the 2020 election, by the way, were that you were able to get an absentee ballot. I mailed applications for an absentee ballot to every listed voter on the voter registry. We have something called the Connecticut Voter Registry, affectionately known as the CVR. And it is maintained, I always remind people, at the local level. The local registrars and clerks, registrars maintain the list. They clear the list every year. That means you're going to get a postcard or some way to update the list every year. And every voter on those lists, active voter, got an application. That was the first source of confusion for people because we had never done that before. The reason we were able to is we did have a federal grant under the CARES Act to be able to make sure everyone knew that they could get an absentee ballot. So they got this application in the mail, and all of a sudden we have a million questions, right? Because many people had never filed or dealt with an absentee ballot before in Connecticut. Our rules are restrictive and they are in our state constitution, which is the reason that we are so far behind the rest of the country on these issues. It's very, very difficult to change the state constitution, even in a pandemic. So that was the dilemma we faced. We were able to get everyone who wanted an absentee ballot got one. You still have to do it. It's a very cumbersome process, frankly, but we did, again, have federal grant money to help the towns facilitate all those thousands of absentee ballots. We had about 650,000 were filed. And the election went more smoothly than any election in my memory. And it was thanks to, you just referred to the fact that we were all trying to get people the information about this change in their ability to file an absentee ballot from their home, because we didn't want people exposing themselves in a crowd. And we have to take ourselves back there. There was no vaccine yet. And so we were dealing with all these pressures. It went marvelously well. I honestly credit the local town clerks with a lot of it and the local registrars because they did the lion's share of the work. But I think mailing those applications to people helped because it let them know the change in the rules. And then, of course, we bought ballot boxes, these drop boxes for every town in the state with the rest of that money. And so people were able to drop those ballots in the ballot box if they chose to. We had some concerns at the time about the Postal Service. That was an enormous help as well. We really changed very little besides those two things. We did things the way we always do them. It was very cumbersome. I'm sure the local clerks had to hire a lot of help to come in on short notice to be able to help facilitate all that. But election day went very, very well. We didn't have the long lines we usually do, of course, but we had the highest voter turnout in the history of the state. And that is really saying something. It was almost 80% of the registered voters voted, and only about 35% of them voted by absentee ballot. So those were the changes we instituted. From my point of view, it was a tremendous success, and voters were very happy with it. I have to say, we did surveys afterwards. 79% of people surveyed, and that's bipartisan, Republicans, unaffiliates, Democrats. They want more access to the absentee ballots in the future. So that's a heavy lift, but we're going to try to accommodate that. But those were the simple changes we made that all happen.
How did, Denise, I was going to ask you, how did we manage the increase in absentee ballots? But I think you pretty much answered that. So I wondered, when you said that a lot of the local officials in each town kind of did the lion's share, did you give instructions on how to process the ballots, that everybody followed the same instructions, or did was it left to each town to kind of figure out what the process was going to be to open the envelopes and sort the mail and then count the ballots?
Oh, no, that's all very strictly controlled by federal and state law. And those were some of the changes we have had to make. The legislature, by the way, did come in, ratify these changes almost unanimously. And so there had to be changes to some extent in the way we processed the absentee ballots. The one change we made that helped the clerks, I think, was that the registrars were able to open the ballots a couple of days earlier so that they could make sure that it helped them a little bit in the processing, because they could do that one step in advance. Connecticut is not what they call a postmark state. A lot of states, you have to be postmarked by election day. In Connecticut, your ballot must be received by election day, by 8 o'clock on election day. We're very strict about that. And I actually think it's a very good rule. But there was so much concern during COVID that people were not getting ballots in a timely way. They weren't able to get them back in a timely way. And you saw a lot of states making those accommodations as well, saying, well, we'll give you more days to get the ballots in, which delays the results, of course. But I think in Connecticut, we stuck to the get your ballot in by 8 o'clock. The ballot boxes help people, and we were able to get ballots out in a very timely way in general. There were certainly some that got lost in the mail or people didn't request them in time, but I think everyone bent over backwards to make sure people got their vote in and it was counted. So those were some of the things we did. We did allow them to open them a little earlier. And honestly, there was a lot of concern about, are there going to be all these spoiled ballots? Because it's so complicated. If you got one of those applications, you have to sign it in a certain place, then you have to send it back. Your ballot gets sent to you by mail. We still have no system to do it otherwise. Then there's all these envelopes and you have to sign the inner envelope, but not the outer one. And, there's all these rules. And that was the hardest part, honestly, is making sure people had the information about all those steps you have to go through. And people, of course, started asking, why do we have to have all these envelopes? Why do we, why does it have to be done exactly this way? That is the system of checks and balances. And then on the other hand, everyone will say, well, how can I know that my vote's secure? How do I know that the integrity, which is the new buzzword, of my vote is safe? And I just respond, well, think of all those envelopes. Think of all those signatures that have to be in the right place. Think about that list you have to be on in just the right place. Think of how many people have their eyes on that ballot. Those steps are all important. And that is, how we maintain integrity. But I will say we had the fewest spoiled ballots ever. We had half the number than we usually have. And again, I credit that public information campaign that all of us mounted in order to get the information to people who had never done this before. So I thought that was also a testimony to the smoothness of this election. It was great.
And I can't remember, in Connecticut, when were the results released? Were they the next day? And some states took them quite a while. Connecticut was faster, I think, wasn't it?
Well, we are always faster because, like I say, you have to get your ballot in by 8 o'clock. Of course, those states that have the postmark rule, they're going to be significantly delayed. I think California gave people 10 days after election day to get their ballot in, that sort of thing. We're in earlier. We have generally 24 hours, but to have some of the results, the actual numbers in. We did give the officials an extra 24 hours, as I recall, a little extra time to get the results in. But honestly, most of the results in were before that.
Thank you. I guess did you mention that 35% of the folks used an absentee ballot? Did you say that?
Yes. Yeah.
And so considering that a no excuse absentee ballot is something that people might like to pursue, what do you think of the two joint resolutions under consideration in the legislature, the efforts being made to expand access to voting in Connecticut? Can you tell us a little bit about those and let us know what you think the prospects are?
Absolutely. And I think they are absolutely essential. Given our experience with this last election, we need to have the rules about how we vote in statute and not in the state constitution. We almost weren't able to let people vote by absentee, even during a pandemic, even when the governor was ordering people to stay home, don't go out in crowds, especially seniors, frankly, and I'm one of them. So I can say that. And so that I am firmly behind both of those resolutions. There are two of them, one to provide for more days of early voting. So in other words, we have to take out the restriction in the Constitution that says you can only vote on Tuesday in November. That's one resolution. That's House Bill 59, or Joint House Resolution 59 is the early voting one. And that one will no doubt be on the ballot in 2022. See, both of these, to change the Constitution, we have to go to a referendum. So these questions need to get on the next statewide ballot. Now, the early voting resolution has already passed once last year. So we need to pass it again with a majority, and then it will go on the ballot in 2022 for all the voters to decide, which is my primary argument for doing both of these things. Is we're letting the voters decide if this is what they want. I really believe after 2020, they want it. I mean, we've done the surveys and I know people can't understand why we're not doing it. The rest of the country is doing most of this. In fact, Georgia's already cutting back on the things we don't even have yet, like days of early voting and absentee balloting and voting by mail. So it's sort of an interesting situation, but it is I think essential, especially that we pass the resolution on taking out the restrictions on absentee ballots. Those are in statute as well. Nothing would change immediately, but we could then make the changes we might want to make depending on the next emergency that comes along, or depending on, what technology changes. There will be technology changes. There will be things that will improve our elections. I know there will. And right now we can't take advantage of a lot of that because it's enshrined in our state constitution. So that resolution, which I believe will come up for a vote next week in the House, it's House Resolution 58. 58, 59, I get them mixed up. But anyway, I think it's 58, will eliminate the restrictions on absentee ballots. Now, frankly, I think that people in Connecticut a lot of people will still want to go to the polls, given if there's not the current situation with COVID. I think 35%, which is what we saw in 2020, is probably the top. Because if anybody wanted to vote in 2020 by absentee, they were going to do that in 2020. I think people in Connecticut kind of like going to the polls. We'll see. I know, but we certainly ought to be able to have the option.
Can we back up for just a second and talk a little bit about, you said in the very beginning that we are one of the most restrictive states when it comes to voting.
Right.
And so can you just give us sort of the cliff notes? Like in Connecticut, my understanding is your options are you can apply for an absentee ballot with an excuse, and it has to be an excuse that's one of 5 things on a list of excuses: disability, travel, armed forces, it's pretty specific.
Yes.
So that's one. And otherwise you have to go to your polling place on election day between the hours of whenever the poll is open. Polls close at 8, I think, throughout Connecticut.
Right. Exactly.
Open at 6:30, 6 or something, or 5. So, and then the other thing is there's no early voting. That's it. It's that one day during that window at your local place, and an absentee only with those excuses.
Correct.
So can you talk a little bit about why making these tweaks, which seem very modest compared to what a lot of other states have, how is that controversial in our state and why? And what are you doing to assure people who are scared of that, that it's okay?
Um, well, my question is always, why would you be scared of this? Why is it controversial? It shouldn't be. Just to give you a couple of examples from other states, the way it's done most of the rest of the country. Colorado is one example. If you live in a county, first of all, they have counties. We have no counties. So elections are run in much bigger blocks, shall we say. If you live anywhere in Fargo County, Colorado, you can vote anywhere on election day. There's multiple polling places. You can vote anywhere in that county at any polling place. But if you voted in the last election, your ballot is mailed to you. No applications, none of that. They just mail you your ballot if you're still on the list, and they've confirmed that you're still on the list. You get your ballot. You can talk to anybody you want about who you're going to vote for. You can sit around the kitchen table and argue about it, and you fill in your ballot and you send it back in. That ballot, that anyone can get one. Everyone gets a ballot. Or you can vote at any number of voting centers throughout your county. And those voting centers are open for, I think it's 10 days before election. So you can drop your ballot off anytime during those 10 days at any one of those voting centers. So that sort of recognizes, I think, more modern life. You don't always live where you work, for example. And so obviously those people have much more access to the ballot than we do, because they have many more opportunities to vote. Part of our problem with having only Tuesday to vote, which is lost in the mists of time, why Tuesday? There's actually a group that formed at one point saying, why Tuesday? It's a good question. A lot of people maybe can't make it on a Tuesday. Maybe they have a job that doesn't allow them to just go off and go to the polls. Many, many absentee ballots are filed from Fairfield County in normal elections because a lot of people commute to New York, and they leave very early in the morning and they don't get back till late at night. Now that falls within one of the excuses that you must be out of town all hours of the polling day, but that's still a very limited access to a very few people who are allowed to do that. So you see the vast differential between our state and other states. And there are even more examples of states where it's even more open. Colorado does it by county. Oregon, you just get mailed your ballot, you fill it out, and you just send it to one central place. And the whole state votes in one central location, if you will. Connecticut, we're the opposite. We're very, very decentralized. Sometimes I bemoan it, and sometimes I think it's a great thing, because I think if anything should assure people that their vote is safe, number one, it's local. You know those people who are right down there at town hall. They're the ones maintaining your list, not me. Our office never touches the list. We keep the server. That's all we do. And I think that's a common misconception that somehow I'm in charge of putting people on this list or taking them off. It's done very carefully. I think we're very, very careful by law before we take someone off a list. And also it's very transparent. Whenever those tabulators are opened at the beginning of the election season, it's open to the public. Anyone can see it. We have two registrars, one from each of the two major parties. They both have to be present when anything is done to ballots or machines or lists. So you see, there's really multiple checks on our system that I think no one ever asked about before. And that's why there's all this suspicion. In the past, I don't remember anybody asking me any of these questions. I think Americans had a really touching faith in their elections. And frankly, I think it was well placed and still is.
Now, we have a couple questions that have come in, I guess, now that we're discussing other what's going on in other states. And is this okay to ask you a question now?
Sure.
Okay. How do the election officials in Colorado know that the voter to whom they mailed a ballot received it and that the ballot was voted by the voter to whom it was sent?
You know, people always ask that question, and it seems so obvious to me that this person has to be on the list. Those lists are very carefully maintained. But even if somehow somebody went to a mailbox and got a ballot that wasn't theirs, maybe somebody moved and somebody new is at that address, it would be a major forgery to take a ballot that isn't yours, fill it out, sign it somehow with somebody else's name, and then send it back. First of all, I would question the motivation for doing any of that. But even if they did that, in Colorado, they do have a signature matching protocol. And that has been under discussion, and we are considering it. If we ever went to a point where there were a lot of absentee ballots, we might consider that. But we are not a state that mails people their ballots, so I'd have to be convinced, honestly. But and it's very expensive, and it makes election officials into signature people, which they very much hate in Colorado. But it is a check on the system, and they've had it in place for quite some time, and there's training that goes on. And when you're doing it by county, it's a lot easier, obviously, because far fewer we have 169 little towns. They have like 6 counties. So it's a much more centralized process, and they do use a signature matching protocol.
Okay. And what is how does Connecticut cooperate with other states to ensure the security of elections when a person, say, moves from Colorado to Connecticut? They might have voted early in Colorado and come to Connecticut. Might they vote again? I mean, how does Connecticut cooperate, with states across the country to ensure election security?
Well, first of all, voters are in charge of their own information. I think that's something that gets lost in all this. The voting officials can only do so much. They have no way of knowing if somebody voted early and then hopped on a plane and came to Connecticut and registered and voted again, except that twice a year, we have a system called ERIC, and I forget what ERIC stands for, but it is an information data sharing system across multiple other states. Most states now, it's a consortium of states. The biggest data set that we exchange are the death records, because frequently people will, let's say in Connecticut's case, move to Florida, and then maybe they die in Florida and they don't tell us, So that's been the biggest source of data that we get. And that exchange is made twice a year and usually just before an election. So that does a pretty good job, I think, of clearing the list nationally.
Thank you. I think, is there a primary on May 3rd for some municipalities?
For some municipalities, yes, we have a few of them left that still do May elections.
And what's the process there? Is there going to be same day registration and, announcements about how to use an absentee ballot? Because I guess you can't use the same rule about the absentee ballot that you used in November, right? That was just a one-time thing. Is that right?
That's right. Although I'm hoping the legislature passes another bill that is up for a vote in the Senate, hopefully this week, that will extend that rule through the fall, that you can get an absentee ballot. And so, of course, there's now lots of confusion in the public, I think, because, of course, we changed the rule just for 2020. And now that's what everyone's asking. Oh, now what? Can I still get an absentee ballot or not? And how does that work? And so right now, as of this moment, no, you must have the same excuses that we've always had. It reverts to the original rule in the state constitution. And there is no election day registration for primaries, just for general elections. So you need to be registered before election day in order to vote in the May elections.
Okay, thank you. I guess I just want to remind the audience that if you want to send in questions, please send them through the Q&A, and we'll be happy to address them to Denise Merrill. What would you say in terms of technology? What might be in the pipeline that might help with voting in the future? Do you know if?
Oh yes, in fact, I have to tip my hat to the governor and the legislature. They just gave us a substantial amount of bond funds to match some federal funds. And we are going to be able to institute some of the things I'm very excited about after the 2020 election. The first one is a ballot tracking system. Somebody just asked about how do you, how does a voter know, how do you know somebody got the ballot? How do they know their ballot was received? Well, there are systems that will allow us to track that ballot, just like UPS tracks your shipment from Amazon right to the door. Gosh, today I got 3. I couldn't even figure out which was which. Man, they let you know every second where that package is and whether it's on your front doorstep, right?
Okay.
Well, it's going to be just like that, and it's wonderful, and I'm very excited about it. That's just one example.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Okay. And what, I guess in a way, this is a loaded question. What have we learned from COVID?
Wow. What we've learned is that we cannot be so rigid. We need to be able to act quickly on behalf of people's health, if it's health, whatever else comes our way. I'm now the veteran of 3 or 4 different crises on election day, most of them related to weather. Some of you go back long enough, you remember I think it was 2012, 2013, where we had that massive storm that created havoc. And it was just 1 week before the election. I mean, there were trees down, there was no electricity at a lot of the polling places. Some of them were underwater, so this has happened more than once within the last decade. And that presents a problem when you cannot make quick decisions about what to do about that. And so that's what I have learned from COVID. We need to be more nimble, and we need to be able to have some sort of public service announcement. I would love a text back system, something where we can alert people to the process, to whatever is happening as a result of that crisis. So for example, this time, if we had had some sort of texting system where we had an open communication with our voters, it's really not that hard to send out messages saying, hey, we don't want you going to the polls. Here's the way you get an absentee ballot, or here's where you get information about X, or whatever it is, or where voters can text us and ask questions. I mean, it should be a very open communication, and that's what I would love to see.
Can I ask you real quick about early voting? You mentioned, of the 2 resolutions that are on the table right now. What would early voting actually look like in Connecticut? Like, would it be at the regular polling places? Is it for 7 days? Is it 10 days? How, is it open the same sort of window of time that the regular polls are open? Since we've not done this in Connecticut, I have no idea. I see right just over the border in Pound Ridge, they have lawn signs all over the place. Early voting begins such and such a day, but I have like no frame of reference for what that looks like.
Well, that would all be up to the legislature. And you know what? They could do none of those things. They could decide they don't want any days of early voting if that's what they chose, because right now those rules are also in statute. So the statutes would have to be changed. All the resolution does is allow it to happen. Now, I have, of course, my favorite, I've looked around the country. There's a lot of examples to choose from. Texas has like 30 days. Florida has 10 days, but they only open town hall because it's already open. I suspect that's because you don't want more cost. You want it to be, if anything, an efficiency measure, not costing more money. So there's a lot of different ways. Then other people, their priority is make it be at least 1 day on the weekend. That's at least when people can get there more easily. So this is all in person. So you have to, I think that would be a balance of what people wanted to do. And, I'm sure everyone will have an opinion. I have mine. I like between 3 and 5 days. I wouldn't say more than that, certainly. And I would say not every polling place, because you wouldn't need all the polling places. You would probably just need town hall, which is already open, and people would probably go into the town clerk's office and file their It's almost like an in-person absentee ballot at that point. But I would like to see one, at least one day on a weekend. I would like to see them very, very close to election day. So I'd say maybe a Friday, Saturday, and Monday, for example. You know, but that could all be hashed out and based on, you know, based on what our technology is at the time too. You know, think about how many machines you would need, how many tabulators. We're going to have to go out and buy new tabulators in the next couple of years. And they will probably have more capacity. They'll be faster. They'll be more secure. Security's become a big issue for all technology in elections. Everybody's questioning whether they can be hacked. I mean, can you imagine if they could be networked together? You'd have a real problem on your hands, which is why I am absolutely not in favor of online voting at this point. I don't think it's secure. Same with these, there are electronic poll books now. We have not purchased those for Connecticut, but maybe in the future, if they can be shown to be secure and not hackable, we might go that direction. So there's a lot of factors. And I think that'll be a wide discussion at the time. If we can ever get this resolution through on the ballot, then I think that's time to discuss it.
What are ID requirements in Connecticut? I know that's been something like that's talked about sort of on the national scene, but what's involved in that in Connecticut? Do you need a driver's license to be able to vote, or?
You know, that's another one of the great ironies of voter IDs, is that Connecticut has one of the earliest voter ID laws in the country. We've had our voter ID law 20 years at least. I remember I was running for office in the early 90s, and I can remember the desk, you'd come up to the counter and the election official would go to check your name off. And I can remember the people in my town, I was in a small town, Mansfield, and they'd say, okay, now we need to see your identification. And people would get really upset. They're like, Marge, I've known you for 30 years. Why are you asking me for my darn driver's license? Come on. I guess we've gotten past that, but Connecticut actually has a very good and pretty strong voter ID law already on the books, which is, yes, you have to present an ID, you are asked for an ID, but it doesn't have to be a specific ID. It has to have certain information on it to show that you are who you say you are and that you live at that address. So it can be, and the classic is a utility bill that has your address and your name printed on it. So I think that's an extremely good law and a very fair law. And yes, if you don't have any ID at all, but you're on the list, then we allow you to vote, you know, in a special situation, you have to sign an affidavit and so forth. So yes, I am the person on that list. And then the officials have time to check it out, make sure nobody else shows up of that name, for example. And by the way, most of these things have never happened. That's what's really upsetting about this whole debate. When people ask me, why should I trust the elections? I always ask, well, why should you not trust the elections? You know, we don't have any experience with lots of fraud. Once in a great while, and I really went back through the records when this all started coming up about 10 years ago, and went to the Election Enforcement Commission, which is the agency that hears these complaints. We don't do enforcement. We just advise the towns. But and I asked the question, how many cases have you had that have not just been charged, but corroborated, but actually have evidence that it happened? And the answer is 1 in 20 years. And that was a student at a college who was a foreign national and thought she had the right to vote because she was living in Connecticut. And so even that example was inadvertent. There was no intent to defraud. So, you know, this whole debate, and that's why you hear all the cries nationally about voter suppression. Suppression might be too strong a word for it, but it is certainly an effort to keep some people from voting, because every time you put a rule in place that's very strict and rigid, you're denying somebody that right to vote. And so if you're going to require well, like in Texas, the classic case about 5 years ago, they passed a law in Texas, a voter ID law that said, here's the list of IDs you can use. And on there, it was okay to use your gun license, but not your student ID, for example. I mean, these are subtle but important differences in the laws in different states. And so that's why I defend our Connecticut law. I think it's fair. I think it's enough to identify people to the right level of surety that they are the person they claim to be, and give the election officials enough information to make sure that things are fair. And that's
Okay,
all.
so we do have an ID law. It's a DMV, a driver's license, or a DMV issued ID, or a utility bill, something that has your name and your address.
Yes, or your name and your a social security card, for example, would work because it has your name and your social security number on it. And that the last 4 digits are used to determine if you're on the list as well. So it has to be basically 2 out of 3 pieces of information. And I know that sounds complicated, but it really isn't. It's an effort to be flexible.
But if your name is on the list,
That's
then
right.
the requirements are not as stringent, as
Correct.
long as you can sign off.
That's exactly right. I think people tend to forget that when you come in to register, you give information about yourself. So if you're on that list, you've already reached one level of identification. You're just corroborating what you said when you signed up.
Thank you. So I was going to say, what can the League of Women Voters do to facilitate, more access to voting? I mean, or more access to the information that people might need about voting.
Oh, I think the league does an amazing job of that, and actually just continue. I think public information is the most important thing all of us should be doing. Programs like this one, for example. But we did get a grant, about $2 million from a foundation. And that's one of the reasons we were so successful this year, because we were able to use that to create TV spots, which is where most people get their information, as well as internet spots and all kinds of other media. But that's the thing now. People reach their information in so many different ways. It's really difficult to get that information out there. I'm feeling really good about what we did this year, but we're not always going to have $2 million to do it. But anything you can do along those lines. One more thing I should mention, and we haven't talked about it, was the incredible number of volunteers who stepped up this year to help out at the polls, which shows you people want to be involved. And the best way to share information about what goes on at the polling place is to get people there and working at the polls. And then they see all the checks and balances, they see how these things are handled. And it's been the best advertising we could do, frankly. We had 10,000 people sign up. I mean, it was amazing. And
That is
a lot
amazing.
of towns used them. They couldn't use all those people, but I think we're going to get a new crew of people in there, especially young people. It's the best way to get them, to really understand it.
I think a lot of people, at least based on what I saw here, a lot of the students, college students who were not on campus, they were at home and they stepped up and volunteered. So I thought that was a good experience for them. Any more questions? How about our audience? Do we have any more questions for Secretary Merrill? Okay. Mickey, do you have any?
Just one more on absentee ballots. Secretary Merrill, you said you mailed out absentee ballots, applications
Yes.
for ballots during COVID. So moving forward, if we are able in Connecticut to allow no excuse absentee voting, the process won't be that your office will mail out applications to everyone. Like, you'll just have to go on to the website and request, or go to town hall and request one. You just won't need an excuse. Is that right?
That's exactly right. We would not have the resources to do that again. We thought it was worth it for the one time to get people the basic information. But I should say that's another technology that I'm excited about, because right now we have no way to get people an electronic copy of the application. So you have to, request one from town hall or it gets mailed to you. Now with this new technology, which I think we'll have in place by the next statewide election, 2020, will allow us to so you'll be able to, email town hall and say, I want an application, here's my name, and they'll be able to email you back the application. You'll be able to sign it and e-sign it and mail it into town hall. That'll save a lot of the mailing back and forth, which has been a big expense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So should we, any more questions? Are you sure? This is a great opportunity to ask Secretary Merrill directly the questions you might have. So any more questions out there from the audience?
When will we know, Secretary Merrill, about these two proposed, I think you said it earlier, but the two proposed joint resolutions for Connecticut?
I hope they will be voted on in the House next week. And so anyone who cares about this, please urge your legislators to vote yes. If we get a 75% vote, the absentee ballot resolution will move forward. It's a big number. It must be bipartisan. It cannot just be one party passing this, and shouldn't be. This is not and should not be a partisan issue. This is for all voters. So I'm hopeful. I don't know for sure we'll get that number, but we'll probably get pretty close to it. So if you can help out, that would be great. And then it has to pass the Senate with 75% as well. So again, we'll see what happens, but that probably will happen next week and the week after. And I'm very hopeful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so should we adjourn? You think? Okay, Secretary Merrill, first of all, thank you so much for spending your time with us. There's nothing better than hearing all of the information that you provided from you directly. You were gracious, we had a good time, and I'm glad we were able to do this. And thanks to Mickey, whose idea this was. And it's been a good collaboration, and I hope we'll do it again sometime. Also to the Darien Library, who made this possible in this era of COVID. We couldn't do it without you. So we want to thank you. And thanks to our audience. Tell all your friends. Thanks again, and stay well, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.